love, then I'm suddenly filled with it. O captain of my heart, radiant eye of yearning in my breast, I will never be free from you as long as I live. Be satisfied with me, love, as I am satisfied. Well, these are very beautiful things. Now I have to turn to the ugly, from the sublime to the ugly and the ridiculous, and talk about hypocrisy and ideology and rationalizations and justifications for violence. And I think our modern age is particularly treacherous. And I think we need to understand the idea of modern fetishism that many others have discussed, but the really most ironic and wonderful discussion is by Marx in Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 1, in the chapter on commodities. Since then, Marx was born before Freud started his work, and he died, I think, before Freud actually started writing his pieces from 1890s on. So he didn't really have any distinct idea of the unconscious, but he expresses, I think, quite clearly in his Political Economy some of the ideas that modern psychoanalysts can connect with, and indeed have connected with, especially people like Erich Fromm and other psychoanalysts who are connected with what some people call the Frankfurt School. Herbert Marcuse, I think, was the most famous or infamous of them from the 1960s. But another critical branch of psychoanalysis is French, following Jacques Lacan and his idea of the imaginary and the real and something in between called the symbolic, which is what we do all the time, and what I'm doing right now, speaking in linguistic symbols. Combining Marx and Lacan, Zizek most articulately, he has written amazing number of books in a few years on this subject of ideology. He manages to unmask a lot of the hypocrisy of our modern discourse. Here is something from a book, a very big book called In Defense of Lost Causes. And the first chapter is called Happiness and Torture in the Atonal World. And the first section, from which I'm going to read a few passages, is called Human, All Too Human. He says, in contrast to the simplistic opposition of good guys and bad guys, spy thrillers with artistic pretensions display all the realistic psychological complexity of the characters from our side. Far from signaling a balanced view, however, this honest acknowledgement of our own dark side stands for its very opposite, for the hidden assertion of our supremacy. We are psychologically complex, full of doubts, while the opponents are one-dimensional, fanatical killing machines. Therein resides the lie of Spielberg's Munich. It wants to be objective, presenting moral complexity and ambiguity, psychological doubts, the problematic nature of revenge, of the Israeli perspective. But what its realism does is redeem the Mossad agents still further. Look, they are not just cold killers, but human beings with their doubts. They have doubts, whereas the Palestinian terrorists, one cannot but sympathize with the hostility with which the surviving Mossad agents who really carried out the revenge killings reacted to the film. There were no psychological doubts. We just did what we had to do, for there is much more honesty in their stance. So here he has laid out the issues. Deception and self-deception, I think, are what we have to get very clear about in our world. And there is too much of that going on every day, every hour. one might even say every minute. He gives another example about how we sometimes try to humanize things too much, although I think he goes too far here, and I will come back to that, but I do want to mention it. He says, a Serb journalist recently reported a strange piece of news from the politician who, after long, painful talks, convinced Slobodan Milosevic in his villa to surrender to the police and let himself be arrested. Milosevic said yes, and then asked to be allowed to go to the first floor of the villa to attend to some business. The negotiator, afraid that Milosevic was going to commit suicide, expressed his doubts. But Milosevic calmed him down, saying that he had given his word to his wife, Mira Markovic, that he would wash his hair before leaving. So Zizek then asks, does this personal life detail redeem the horrors that resulted from Milosevic's reign? Does it make him more human? One can well imagine Hitler washing Eva Braun's hair. And one does not have to imagine, since we already know that Haider, the architect of the Holocaust, liked to play Beethoven's late string quartets with friends in the evenings. So there is this way of trivializing, I think, great horrors in our time in the name of humanizing the perpetrators. I do think that everybody is redeemable, although some people seem so far gone that it might take amazing superhuman or perhaps supernatural effort to redeem them. But I think at the phenomenological level, at the level of ordinary life and ordinary politics and ordinary moral perceptions, Zizek is pointing out to the banality of our moral discourse and banality of the usual humanistic discourse. And he mentions here one director who is actually somebody I admire greatly, Lars von Trier. Lars von Trier was honest enough to actually let the cat out of the bag about his filmmaking technique, although he is quite subtle, so one shouldn't take everything he says at face value. But here is what he told the critics after they had praised him to the skies. He said, "My very first film, The Orchid Gardener, opened with a caption stating that the film was dedicated to a girl who had died of leukemia, giving the dates of her birth and death. That was entirely fabricated and manipulative and cynical, because I realized that if you started a film like that, then the audience would take it a lot more seriously." Of course, you know that people who are really good at manipulating the media can get ahead in life, in our world especially, which is so much a world of make-believe. But I certainly don't advocate this to my students or my friends or to the world. So Zizek then adds his comments, "There is much more than manipulation at work here. In his feminine trilogy, Breaking the Waves, Dancer in the Dark, Dogville, they're all great films, von Trier provokes us in our innermost being, stirring up automatic sympathy with the ultimate archetypal image of the victimized woman who, with her heart of gold, suffers pain. Through his, quote, manipulation, unquote, he displays the lie of this sympathy, the obscene pleasure we gain from seeing the victim suffer, and thereby disturbs our self-satisfaction. Does this mean, however, that my truth is simply in my symbolic identity obfuscated by my imaginary inner life, as a simplistic reading of Lacan seems to indicate, opposing the subject of the signifier to the imaginary ego?" Well, that's one way of putting the question psychoanalytically. But in terms more familiar to us, it is really a question of what it is that you give importance to, and how do you really perceive reality, and how do you distinguish truth from falsehood? How do you distinguish the fakeness from the below the surface depth? And here, political economy surprisingly actually has an answer. Marx, as I said, points out in his discussion of fetishism of commodities that modern isolated production system, if you actually take it in the limit, a kind of classical liberalism in its ideal form, that every person is free and every person is able to be, by free choice, either an entrepreneur or a worker. Of course, in reality, most people, as we see, are workers of one sort or another. And then there is this realm of freedom of exchange, because we exchange things freely, including our capacity for work. And what appears in the world to us, and much more so today than in Marx's time, really are masses of commodities, masses of things that we can buy and sell, things, and more things. And what we see really are relationships among things, which are then abstracted from them by something called money. Then we put a price on them, which is what classical political economists call value. And they ask the really important question, what is the source of this value? And that was the scientific question to ask, which we have forgotten, since the end of the 19th century. And Marx, with the help of Smith and Ricardo, but going way beyond them, discovered that what we really have when we are exchanging commodities is exchange of labor. That is what really is going on in society. But we don't really see that. We just see the exchange of commodities. We see a surface symbol. We see money. We see prices. And he was being very ironic, because before that, fetish was only supposed to be applicable to these underdeveloped African tribes, people who worship these inanimate objects. So Marx actually played the final joke on his arrogant European compatriots, that actually what we see in modernity, in modern capitalism, is nothing other than fetishes. That we live in a fetishized world, that we put value on, and we connect emotionally with these symbols. The psychoanalytic term later that Freud and others would be using is cathexis, that we connect with these things. And that just sounds right. I mean, it's just this cold and scientific way to look at this craziness that goes for modern life. But if I stop there, I would be unfair to modernity. And so let me try to present something a little more on the other side. And that other side really has to do with the search for values, search for ethical values. And the person who did this the best was Kant. Immanuel Kant is really a deep thinker, and sometimes I think he is the deepest thinker the Western modernity really produced, and will probably never produce another again. Kant wrote a little-known essay for a journal in Berliner Monatsschrift, in the 1780s. And the question was given to several people. It was, was heißt Aufklärung? Now, those of you who know German, that means what is enlightenment, right? And different people said different things. But Kant really asked the question that this, what could this really be, other than asking the question, who am I, who are we at this moment? And how do I know who I am at this moment, separated from other moments, can only be put in the form of another question, which is, can I actually create normativity? Can I create an ethics? And can we, in Western Europe, create a normativity and ethics out of ourselves without any other kind of support through the practice of reason. Well, Kant had already realized that pure reason really doesn't answer questions about things in themselves, the real ontological questions. He was a pietist, by the way. He was not an atheist. He was quite religious, as far as I can tell. But he kept that part separate from his philosophical investigations. And therefore, it was natural for him to ask if we could create normativity in a non-religious way. In some ways, you can see Locke before him asking the question somewhat more implicitly or less explicitly. But Kant put it very, very clearly. And Foucault, of all people, actually picks up on it. And in an essay called Subject and Power, he asks the same question and says that, yes, we can actually accept that question from the Enlightenment if we are much more clear about who we are. And that really brings us back to the whole question of self and spirit. So the debate, of course, is something that is not yet finished. And let me just quote one thing from Foucault so that the question can be put as clearly as he put it. He says, in other words, what are we as Aufklärer, as part of the Enlightenment? Compare this with the Cartesian question, who am I as a unique but universal and unhistorical subject? I, for Descartes, is everyone, everywhere, at any moment. But Kant asks something else. What are we in a very precise moment of history? Kant's question appears as an analysis of both us and our present. And that's where we are, really, when we are talking about violence and religion and spirituality. We are trying to analyze our moment, our world, our history, our relationships, with parts of the world that sometimes we wrongly think, out of our ignorance, really don't know anything about enlightenment, really don't know how to ask philosophical questions, really do not have spirituality, really do not have anything like Reformation that occurred throughout the history of Christianity. All those things actually are at best partially true, but largely wrong. And it would take me a long time to go through the history of Islamic thought to explain all these things in detail. Fortunately, many others have done it already. And our colleague Nader, who is not here, spends quite a few chapters in his book on Islam, secularism, and democracy to analyze in detail how secularism evolved out of religious ideas in the West, especially during the English Civil War, something that people don't pay too much attention to, but I think they should. I know my colleague Jack Donnelly and I occasionally had discussions about the English Civil War, and we both agree that people should pay much more attention to the English Civil War than they usually do. Everybody talks about French Revolution and Russian Revolution, but really the English Revolution, which lasted a whole century, and the reverberations are still being felt,